Snack and Learn webinar. I hope you have some tasty snacks with you and that you are ready to learn about fiber sediments. My name is Hanna Almqvist and I'm going to talk about a source of contamination that is common in Swedish water bodies, but that we are still learning about. And that is the fiber sediments, a legacy from our many paper and pulp mills across the country. I will give you a short introduction to what fiber sediments are and how they pose a risk. And I will talk about a risk classification method that we developed to help the authorities prioritize between the different locations. If you have any questions, please post them in the question box and I will try to answer them at the end of the session. And I am also curious to know if anyone has experience with this type of contaminant from around the globe. So please also post in the question box if you do, and maybe something short on how you assess and remediate them in your country. The presentation is available in the handout box in the GoToWebinar platform. Okay, let's start. 70% of Sweden is covered by forests, and the country is one of the world's largest exporters of pulp, paper, and sawn timber. We have had and still have many paper and pulp mills, especially along the Baltic coast, which is the east coast of Sweden. On the image to the right, you can see an inventory of Swedish paper and pulp mills, and there are hundreds of them. On this photo from 1929, we can see no less than 3 paper mills on the same river in northern Sweden. So they were quite dense. Before 1969, we didn't have any legislation on treating the wastewater, and the paper and pulp mills released large amounts of cellulose fibers into rivers, lakes, and the Baltic Sea. The cellulose fibers in the wastewater were deposited on the seafloor near the outlets from the mills and formed large deposits called fiber banks. On this slide, you can see 3 images of fiber sediments, and you can see that the fibers can vary in size and shape, and they can be more or less decomposed. A lot of fibers have been released. It has been estimated that between 1908 and 1983, Swedish paper and pulp mills released 10 million tons or 10 billion kilograms of fibers into Swedish water bodies. And when the wood fibers land on the seafloor, they are decomposed by microorganisms, a process that uses oxygen and thus creates oxygen depletion, which on its own is an environmental problem. But a lot of contaminants were released together with the fibers, either substances that were used in the paper and pulp mills or pesticides from the forest industry. And here are some examples of contaminants associated to the fibers. I won't go into them all, but I can mention heavy metals from pyrite ash or green liquor, and they are different waste products depending on if it's a sulfite or sulfate mill, sorry. Mercury and methyl mercury to prevent microbial growth on the pulp sludge. There were bleaching chemicals and plant protectors, among other things. So as you can see, there can be a lot of different contaminants in the fibers. A conceptual model of a fiber bank or an area with fiber-rich sediments can be quite complex, as you can see on this image, created by the Swedish Geological Survey. It doesn't contain all transport pathways or all receptors, but I choose it since it's in English. Spreading is often the most important risk. Fibers can be spread through submarine landslides. The fiber banks are often quite steep, and the fibers stick together through cohesion. So if they get a little help from waves or currents, they can slide away on the sea bottom. Fibers can also resuspend into the water with the help of wind, waves, or currents. And what about receptors? Well, the fibers can pose a risk to benthic and aquatic organisms, and many of the contaminants in the fibers bioaccumulate, which means they can harm organisms higher up in the food chain, like predator birds in this picture or humans. The fiber banks are often located in shallow waters. I have investigated one area where there was only 50 centimeters of water above the fiber sediments, and that means there's a risk of direct contact for humans. And also since the last ice age, when land was pushed down by thick ice layers, Sweden is rising, in some areas by as much as a few centimeters each year. And this uplift causes the fibers to elevate and get closer to the water surface. And the risk increases. Humans can also be exposed to the contaminants through, for example, drinking water or fish and crayfish farms, but that's not shown in this conceptual model. Okay, that was a short introduction to the fiber sediment problem. Of course, there's a lot more to say, and a lot of research is going on at the Swedish universities, and also in collaboration with problem owners and consultants. But I will move on to talk about a project that I did while working at Golder a few years ago. And this was before we knew very much about the fiber sediments in Sweden. A handful of sites had been investigated and a few had been remediated, but we didn't know the full scale of the problem. Swedish authorities, with the Swedish Geological Survey in lead, did an inventory of the Swedish fiber sediments in 2010 to 2014, and they realized that we might have a lot of fiber sediments hidden in our lakes and the Baltic Sea. And they produced this image on the right of all the potential fiber sediments that I showed in the beginning. And they understood this could be a major environmental problem, but they didn't know where to start, how to know which sites were the worst and should be investigated and remediated first. And this, of course, is a problem with all contaminated sites. And the Swedish EPA has a system for risk classification that they developed as early as 1999. And that one has been used to classify all potential contaminated sites that has been found in Sweden. 80,000 sites have been classified in a 4-graded scale using this method. And it was supposed to be used for all kinds of sites to get a consistent method, but as you could see on the previous slide, the conceptual model, fiber sediments are quite complex and the risk classification system was not suitable. And when the authorities tried to classify the fiber sediments using the Swedish EPA method, they all ended up in the highest risk category. And of course, that didn't help at all when they wanted to prioritize between the sites. Therefore, the county administration board in Västernorrland, a county with a lot of paper and pulp industry, asked Golder to develop a new risk classification system that was better adjusted to the fiber sediments that the authorities could use to prioritize between all the fiber sediment sites. The goal of the risk classification method and our scope was for it to be easy to use, objective, that is, it should give the same results no matter who used it. Of course, it needed to be correct, and very importantly, it needed to work with a limited data set because we didn't know very much about the fiber sediments at this point. And our solution was to create a simple Excel tool that you can see in this screen dump. And with a little help from my friends, as Beatles sang, or maybe more accurately, with a little help from an information management colleague, we could get the Excel spreadsheet to work automatically and move contaminants from one sheet to the next and change colors of cells and all kind of cool tricks that I wouldn't have been able to do myself. The tool is divided into 4 different sheets in the same way as the SWE EPA risk classification method. And those are contaminant characteristics, level of contamination, risk of dispersal or spreading, and risks associated with exposed humans and environment. And I will go through them all quickly now. I'm afraid all the screen dumps will be in Swedish, but I think you'll be able to understand what we did anyway. I hope so. The first sheet, contaminant characteristics, just lets you choose which contaminants that you've found on the site or that you believe could be there. Swedish EPA has grouped all kinds of contaminants based on their hazardousness, so that was already done. And if more hazardous contaminants can be found, the risk class gets higher. On most sites, they had done some very simple sampling, like maybe 1 plunge with a sediment sampler, and results from that investigation was used to characterize the contaminants. And you just tick the box for all the contaminants that can be found on the site, and then these substances will be copied to the next sheet on the Excel spreadsheet. And the model we created contains a number of contaminants that are commonly associated with fiber sediments, the ones I mentioned before. But you can add other substances as well if you have found something else on your site. On the next sheet, you assess the level of contamination. And here we both assess how big the fiber sediments are. I mean, how much fibers we have, and we also assess how high the concentrations are in relation to background levels and guideline values. Yes, sorry. The substances were copied from the first sheet, and the model does an automatic assessment of the level of contamination and color codes it: green, yellow, orange, and red, depending on how many times the background or guideline value is exceeded. Okay, risk of dispersal. The most important risk associated to the fiber sediments is the risk of spreading the contaminants to other parts of the water body or to more sensitive areas. And therefore, the capability of dispersal is an important part of the risk classification, and that is what we are assessing in the third sheet. We tried to do as many automatic assessments as possible to make sure the model was objective and that it wouldn't matter who did the classification. The results would still be the same. For example, water depth, fiber type, if the fibers are large or small, boat traffic, waves, and occurrence of halocline were assessed automatically. And the user just chooses an answer in a drop-down menu, and this gives a risk value. For example, shallow water means there's a greater risk of spreading by waves, and this gives a greater risk value compared to deeper waters. Some of the factors are more important for the risk classification, and therefore we have also given all factors a weight. And the risk value and the weight are multiplied and gives a product, and all products are summed. And that summed value is translated into words and color-coded. For example, major risk of dispersal is red, or low risk of dispersal is colored green. So as you understand, this was a simple way of trying to get an objective tool. One thing that was quite difficult was to decide on the weight of the different factors. I mean, is shallow water level more important than the size of the fibers when it comes to spreading? Or how much will a halocline limit the dispersal? Or how bad is it if there's a waterway for big ferries close to the fiber sediments? And we didn't really know, and all of these factors are probably very site specific, but here we had to develop a model that worked for all kinds of fiber sediments. And I'd say that is an uncertainty in the model. For some of the more complex factors, we were not able to do an automatic assessment, and the user had to assess the risk manually. And there was factors that control spreading and uptake in the food web mainly. Okay, last sheet. On the last sheet, we assessed how sensitive the area and the surroundings are, both in terms of risk for humans, like if there's a public beach nearby where a lot of people could be exposed to the contaminants, and in terms of risk for the environment, like if there were any sensitive species in the area or downstream. We used the same system with automatic assessments here too, and that means the user chooses an answer in a drop-down menu, and this gives a summarized risk value for those categories. When you have worked your way through all of these sheets, you open the summary sheet and find all the relevant info on one page, easy to print. And in the end, the model gives you a risk classification for your site in the same 4-graded system that the Swedish EPA used for their old risk classification system. And we used the same scale because we wanted to be able to compare the fiber sediments to sites on land, but we had to extend the highest risk group, the class 1, into 3 different subgroups to be able to separate the different sites. And in this example, for instance, the fiber sediments were classified in class 1B, very large risk, and the authorities will probably prioritize it quite early on in their investigations. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to talk about is how the model was implemented. It was used to classify fiber sediments in the northern part of Sweden. And we at Golder, the consultants, did not do the risk classification. The authorities did that. They used our tool. And I think that was good, because otherwise there could have been a conflict of interest, since we work or have worked or maybe would like to work for many of the paper and pulp mills around the country. And then it wouldn't have been very good if we did the risk classification. Most sites were classified in the second or third class, as you can see on this graph, the 1B or 1C class. But the spread between the classes looks pretty good, and I think this simple tool has been a good help when deciding on how to prioritize between the sites. If a site was classified in a specific group, the operator or owner of the fiber sediment could argue or appeal against it and show that their fiber sediments should actually have a lower risk classification. Because, I mean, maybe they know more about their sites than the authorities do. Okay, I hope you have finished your snack, because it is time to sum it all up. The risk classification of fiber sediments. The paper and pulp industry has been great for the Swedish economy, but it might have left hundreds of sites with fiber sediments in our waters. Those fiber sediments cause oxygen depletion, and they can contain a cocktail of contaminants. So an easy-to-use method was needed to prioritize between the sites. And the solution was an Excel-based model that could be used by different users at municipalities all over the country with similar results. And this very simple model has helped authorities understand which sites are the worst and where to focus the energy. That was all I had. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Hanna, for a fantastic presentation. So before moving into the Q&A period, I would like to remind attendees to enter your questions in the question box on the GoToWebinar platform, and also you can download the PDF version of the presentation from the handout box on the dashboard. Hanna, please, if you can open your webcam, please. Thank you. You mentioned that the fibers are decomposed by microorganisms, and that this can cause oxygen depletion. Can it also produce methane?
Yes, it can. I recently read a paper from Uppsala University where they had investigated the amount of greenhouse gas emissions from the fiber sediments. And I think they found that the Swedish fiber banks, they have a potential to produce methane and carbon dioxide that correspond to 7% of Sweden's total known greenhouse gas emissions. So yeah, that is another potential problem with the fiber banks, definitely.
Thank you. The next question is, are fiber sediments just a Swedish problem, or do they also exist in other parts of the world?
Yes, well, that's a good question. A question that I also have. In another project that I did just a few years ago, we tried to find info on fiber sediments from around the world, but it was quite difficult. We found some sites in the Great Lakes in USA and a few sites in Canada, and we found one site in Finland in a lake. But I mean, there are paper and pulp industries all over the world, and they have probably released cellulose fibers too. So I would guess there are more fiber sediments out there to be found. One problem is that I think we have different names in different parts of the world. In Sweden, we call them fiber sediments and fiber banks and maybe fiber-rich sediments. But I've heard names like pulp deposits or organic-rich sediments or organic enriched sediments or just cellulose-rich sediments. I think in Finland they call them zero fiber. So I mean, that's a problem also to find info in different countries because we have different names for them.
Thank you. So how do you remediate fiber sediments in Sweden? How do the municipality take action on this research?
Yes, a few sites have been remediated, both financed by authorities and by private problem owners. One site in northern Sweden, in Luleå, is being remediated right now. As I mentioned, a lot of research is conducted, and some of it focuses on remediation methods. It's quite difficult. The fiber sediments, of course, contain a lot of organic matter, and if you dig them up, you can't just put them on a landfill. You have to burn them, and they contain quite a lot of contaminants. So another remediation method would be to cover them up with clean material. But that's also very difficult because the density of those fibers is very low. I didn't mention that, but it can be even lower than the density of water. So you'd believe they would float on the water surface, but they stick together through some kind of cohesion processes. But if you try to cover them up, the cover material just sinks through the fiber sediments. So that's another area where we need to learn more, and we are trying to learn more too.
Fantastic, thank you. So we don't have additional questions, so today is a shorter webinar. Thank you, Hanna, for a fantastic presentation. So we're at the end of our webinar session. Please feel free to follow up directly with Hanna via the contact details shown on the screen. And thank you for joining, everyone. Have a wonderful day. I will wrap up the webinar now. Thank you.
Thank you.